Sleepyhead. Shift a little until it feels right. There's no perfect position, just comfort. Let your face soften, your shoulders drop, your hands rest. Take a breath in and let it fall away. You've done enough for today, truly. Tonight, I'm bringing you to New York City in the autumn of 1929, a quiet story about how the world held its breath and how the morning always came after. It's okay if your mind drifts. That's part of it. Let's begin.
Chapter 1. The sound of prosperity. Somewhere in the distance, a hammer strikes steel. Then another, and another. A steady, patient rhythm, like a heartbeat heard through a wall. It is the sound of a building going up. One of a dozen, perhaps 2 dozen, rising simultaneously from the bedrock of Manhattan in the summer of 1928. If you were to stand at the corner of 5th Avenue and 34th Street on a warm July morning, tilt your head back and shield your eyes from the sun, you would see the skeletons of new towers reaching upward through the haze, their iron ribs dark against a pale and cloudless sky. This is where our story begins. Not with a crash, not with a crisis, but with a sound. The sound of building. The sound of a nation that believed, with a kind of quiet and unshakable certainty, that it was constructing something permanent. The morning light falls differently in New York than in other cities. It arrives from the east, off the Atlantic, and by the time it reaches the avenues, it has already passed through layers of salt air and river mist, so that it lands on the brownstone facades and limestone ledges with a particular softness, an amber warmth, as though the city itself were lit from within. In the summer of 1928, that light fell on a city in motion. Delivery trucks idled at the curbs of Lower Broadway. Newsboys called out the morning headlines from the steps of Pennsylvania Station. Women in drop-waist dresses walked arm in arm beneath the striped awnings of department stores, their heels clicking a brisk, contented rhythm against the sidewalk. And beneath it all, beneath the clatter and the commerce, and the 10,000 small transactions of an ordinary morning, there was a hum. You could feel it more than hear it. A low, steady vibration running through the pavement and up through the soles of your shoes, through the brass handrails of the subway entrances, through the revolving doors of the great hotels. It was the hum of prosperity, and it was everywhere. America, in the late 1920s, was a country that had learned to believe in tomorrow. The Great War was a decade past. Its trenches and its gas and its terrible arithmetic of young men lost, all of that had receded into the kind of memory that lives in monuments and memorial speeches, invoked on certain holidays and then gently set aside. What had taken its place was something brighter, something almost giddy in its optimism. The automobile had transformed the landscape. The radio had transformed the living room. Electricity had transformed the night. And now, in the closing years of the decade, a new force was transforming the way ordinary Americans thought about money, about the future, about the very shape of their lives. The stock market. Not so long ago, the buying and selling of stocks had been the province of bankers and the very wealthy, men in dark suits who moved through the mahogany corridors of downtown offices and spoke a private language of bonds and dividends and preferred shares. But something had shifted, slowly at first, and then with gathering speed, the stock market had opened its doors to the rest of the country, and the rest of the country had walked in. Picture, if you will, a shoeshine boy on the corner of Broad Street, just a few steps from the columned entrance of the New York Stock Exchange. His name doesn't matter. He is young, 17, perhaps 18, with quick hands and a rag that moves in practice circles across the leather toe of a banker's Oxford. He has been working this corner for 2 years. He knows the rhythms of the street, the way a fisherman knows the tides, the early morning rush of clerks and secretaries, The midday lull when the brokers retreat to their clubs for lunch. The late afternoon surge when the closing bell sends a river of men in grey suits pouring down the steps and out into the fading light. And he has been listening. Day after day, he has listened to the conversations that pass above his bent head. Fragments of talk about Radio Corporation of America, about General Motors, about a new issue of stock in something called the Shenandoah Corporation that was said to be a sure thing. He has heard the numbers, he has watched the faces, and some weeks ago he took his savings, $47, kept in a coffee can beneath his bed in a boarding house on Delancey Street, and he bought his first shares. He is, in his own small way, a speculator now. And he is not alone. Across the country, in small towns and large cities, in farmhouses and apartment buildings, Americans were discovering the stock market the way they had once discovered the motor car, with wonder, with appetite, and with a cheerful disregard for the instruction manual. A dentist in Cleveland, a schoolteacher in Des Moines, a retired postman in Savannah who read about the market in his evening paper and decided, with a confidence that surprised even himself, that he would like to own a small piece of American industry. They gathered in brokerage offices, those curious, semi-formal rooms that had begun to spring up in every city and town, furnished with leather chairs and long blackboards where young men in shirt sleeves chalked up the latest prices as they came clicking in over the ticker. Customers' rooms, they were called. And they were, in their way, a kind of theatre. People sat in rows, watching the numbers change, murmuring to one another, sometimes applauding when a favourite stock ticked upward by a point or two. The atmosphere was not frantic. It was pleasant, expectant, like the feeling in a concert hall just before the music begins. There was a phrase people used in those days, though no one could quite remember who had said it first. They said the market was on a permanent plateau, that it had reached a new and stable height from which it would never descend. The phrase had a lovely, reassuring solidity to it, like the sound of a heavy door closing securely behind you. A permanent plateau, a place to stand, a place from which to see the future stretching out in every direction, green and untroubled and full of promise. Calvin Coolidge, the president who had presided over most of this decade of growth, was a man of few words, legendarily few. He was thin, red-haired, and so quiet in social situations that the writer Dorothy Parker, upon hearing the news of his death years later, reportedly asked how anyone could tell. But his silence was, in its way, a kind of eloquence. It said, "All is well. The machinery of American life is running smoothly. There is no need for alarm, no need for intervention, no need for anything at all except to step aside and let prosperity do its gentle, tireless work." And so the summer of 1928 passed, slowly, warmly, the way summers are supposed to pass. In the evenings, when the heat of the day had softened into something bearable, families gathered on their front porches and stoops, and the air carried the scent of cut grass and the distant sound of someone's radio playing through an open window, a dance band perhaps, or the rich, unhurried voice of a news announcer reading the day's closing prices. The Dow Jones Industrial Average, that simple and reassuring number, had been climbing steadily for months. It moved upward with the slow, predictable grace of a balloon released into a still sky. 200, 250, 300. Each new milestone greeted not with alarm or even great excitement, but with a quiet nod of satisfaction, the way one greets the arrival of a season that was expected and is welcome. No one that summer spoke of what was to come. No one could have. The future is, by its nature, a country no one has visited, and the people of 1928 were no different from the people of any other year in their inability to see beyond the gentle curve of the present moment. They lived, as we all live, in the small, bright circle of what they knew, and what they knew that summer was that the sun was warm, the market was rising, and tomorrow, in all likelihood, would be very much like today. The construction workers on the high steel didn't think about it. They thought about rivets and lunch pails and the long commute home to Queens. The shoeshine boy didn't think about it. He thought about his $47, now worth $53, and about the new pair of shoes he would buy when the number reached 60. The banker in his marble office didn't think about it because there was nothing to think about. The numbers were good, the clients were happy, and the leather chair beneath him was soft and deep and paid for. And the city went on humming. It hummed through the long afternoons and into the blue evenings, through the weekends and the holidays, through the slow golden turning of one season into the next. It hummed the way a mother hums to a child who is not quite asleep. Not any particular melody, just a low, steady sound, a vibration in the air that says, "You are safe. You are held. The world is solid beneath you." Let yourself settle into that sound now. Let the hum of 1928 become the hum of this room, this moment, this quiet hour. The story will go on. There is much to tell about the people who built their dreams on the rising tide of the market, about the towers of paper and confidence they constructed, about the autumn that would come, as autumns always do, to change the colour of everything. But that is for later. For now there is only the summer. There is only the warmth of the light on the brownstone walls, the distant tap of a hammer on steel, the soft and steady hum of a nation at rest. Close your eyes if you like. We are in no hurry. The story will be here when you are ready. And the market rose, and the people believed, and the summer went on. Chapter 2. The Marble Halls of Lower Manhattan. If you had walked south along Broadway on a Tuesday morning in the autumn of 1928, past the shoe stores and the haberdasheries, past the flower sellers and the pretzel carts, past the great stone bulk of City Hall with its cupola catching the light, you would have arrived, in time, at a canyon. Not a canyon of rock and river, but a canyon of stone and glass and marble. The buildings rose up on either side of you like the walls of a gorge, close and tall and serious, their facades darkened by decades of city soot, their windows reflecting the narrow strip of sky overhead in pale, wavering rectangles. The light at street level was filtered and indirect, as though you had stepped beneath the canopy of a very old forest, and the air was different here. Cooler, heavier, scented faintly with ink and brass polish and the warm electrical smell of ticker tape machines running behind closed doors. This was Wall Street. Not the idea of it, but the physical place. A real street, shorter than most people imagine, only 7 blocks long, running from Broadway at its western end to the East River at its eastern. It was and remains one of the most famous streets in the world, and one of the least dramatic to look at. There were no bright signs, no waving flags. The architecture did the talking, and what it said, in the language of Corinthian columns and bronze doors and carved granite lintels, was permanence, solidity, the absolute and unshakable confidence of money. Let us step inside. The lobbies of the great banking houses in those years were designed to do one thing, and they did it magnificently. They made you feel small. Not in a cruel way, but in the way that a cathedral makes you feel small, by presenting you with so much height and space and quiet grandeur that your own concerns seem, for a moment, to shrink to their proper proportion. The ceilings were 30 feet high, sometimes 40, and they were coffered in dark wood or decorated with painted allegorical scenes, commerce shaking hands with industry, justice holding her scales above the heads of ships and trains and smokestacks. The floors were marble, always marble, and your footsteps echoed as you crossed them in a way that made you instinctively lower your voice. Tellers stood behind bronze grills, their movements practiced and unhurried. Clerks moved between desks with sheaves of paper held carefully in both hands, like altar boys carrying candles. The telephones, when they rang softly and were answered on the first ring. Everything was designed to convey a single, calming message. Your money is safe here. It is in capable hands. There is nothing whatsoever to worry about. The men who ran these institutions were, by 1928, among the most powerful people in the world, though they would not have described themselves that way. They would have said they were bankers, simply bankers, and that banking was a profession of service, of stewardship, of quiet responsibility. They sat in offices with panelled walls and heavy curtains, their desks bare except for a single telephone, and perhaps a leather-framed photograph of a wife and children at a summer house on Long Island. They smoked cigars, but not ostentatiously. They wore dark suits, well cut but not flashy. They spoke in measured sentences, choosing their words the way a watchmaker chooses his tools, precisely, and with an awareness that small errors can have large consequences. Charles Mitchell was one of them, the president of National City Bank, the largest bank in the country. He was a large man with a broad, genial face and a salesman's gift for enthusiasm. Where other bankers cultivated an air of aristocratic reserve, Mitchell radiated warmth, energy, a kind of electric confidence that made people want to follow him. He believed, with every fiber of his considerable being, that the American economy was a machine of limitless potential, and that the role of a banker was not to stand cautiously at the controls, but to open the throttle and let the engine run. Under Mitchell's leadership, National City Bank had done something that would have been unthinkable a generation earlier. It had begun selling stocks and bonds directly to ordinary Americans, not just the wealthy, but the middle class, the working class, anyone with a few $100s and a willingness to believe. Mitchell's salesmen fanned out across the country like missionaries, opening branch offices, hosting informational luncheons, placing advertisements in local newspapers that made investing sound as simple and sensible as opening a savings account. And it worked. The money flowed in. From every corner of the country, it flowed in. But Mitchell was only one figure in a much larger landscape, and the landscape itself is what concerns us now. Imagine that you are standing at a window, very high up, looking out over the financial district on a clear morning. From this height, the individual people are too small to distinguish. What you see instead are patterns, the slow currents of pedestrians moving along the sidewalks, the brief pauses at intersections, and then the resumption of movement. The delivery trucks inching through the narrow streets like boats navigating a crowded harbor. And above it all, the steady, unhurried procession of clouds drifting eastward toward the sea. From this height, the whole enterprise looks peaceful, almost meditative. You cannot hear the telephones or the ticker machines. You cannot hear the voices calling out prices on the trading floor of the New York Stock Exchange, that high-ceilinged room at the corner of Broad and Wall, where every weekday morning, 6 days a week, hundreds of men in dark jackets gathered to buy and sell small pieces of the American future. The New York Stock Exchange in 1928 was a place of ritual. It opened each morning at 10 o'clock with the ringing of a brass bell, a clear high note that cut through the murmur of the trading floor like the first bird of morning. The men who worked there were called brokers, and they had their assigned posts, their regular stations on the floor, arranged around the tall octagonal structures known as trading posts, each one dedicated to a group of stocks. The posts were made of dark wood and brass, and they rose up from the floor like the pillars of a temple, each one topped with an indicator board that displayed the latest prices in small, glowing numbers. The trading itself was done by voice and by hand. A broker who wanted to buy 100 shares of US steel would walk to the post where steel was traded, catch the eye of the specialist, the man who managed the market in that particular stock, and call out his bid. The specialist would match it with a seller or note it in his ledger if no seller was immediately available. The transaction was confirmed with a nod, sometimes with a scribbled note on a small slip of paper. And then the price would change by a fraction of a point, and the new number would appear on the indicator board, and the information would be transmitted by wire to the ticker tape machines in brokerage offices across the country, where it would emerge as a thin ribbon of printed paper, curling gently into the waiting hands of a clerk or a customer or a shoeshine boy studying the symbols he was only beginning to understand. It was, in its way, a kind of clockwork, intricate, reliable, and strangely beautiful. The ticker tape itself deserves a moment of our attention because it was, in those years, one of the most intimate objects in American life, more personal than a newspaper, more immediate than a radio broadcast. It was a narrow strip of paper, about 3/4 of an inch wide, and it ran continuously through the glass dome machines that sat on desks and counters in offices from New York to San Francisco. The machines made a soft, rhythmic clicking as they printed, a sound that became, for an entire generation of Americans, the sound of money itself, the audible pulse of the economy. People handled the tape with a curious tenderness. They would pick it up and let it run through their fingers the way a tailor runs a bolt of silk, reading the symbols and numbers as they passed, the abbreviated names of companies, the prices at which their shares had last changed hands. R, C, A, G, M, U, S, S, T, L. The abbreviations became a kind of poetry, a private language shared by millions, and the tape itself, after it had been read, would curl into loose spirals on the floor, gathering in soft piles around the legs of chairs and desks, so that by the end of a busy trading day, the floor of a brokerage office might be ankle deep in the stuff, a landscape of discarded information, already obsolete, already history. Let us slow down here. Let the image settle. Imagine the late afternoon light falling through the tall windows of one of these offices. It is October now, early October 1928, and the light has that particular quality that autumn light has in the northeastern cities, a golden thickness, as though the air itself has been steeped in tea. The office is quiet. Most of the customers have gone home. A single clerk sits at a desk near the window, carefully rolling a length of ticker tape around his fingers, the way a child rolls a strand of yarn. The tape is still warm from the machine. The numbers printed on it are already old. They reflect transactions that took place hours ago, prices that have already shifted and will shift again tomorrow. But the clerk doesn't mind. He is not looking at the numbers. He is looking at the light. It falls across his desk in a long, warm parallelogram, illuminating the grain of the wood, the brass cup of pencils, the half-empty glass of water with its slow, rising bubbles. Through the window, he can see the tops of the buildings across the street, their cornices dark against the fading sky. Below, the street is already in shadow. A taxicab turns the corner with a soft squeal of rubber on pavement. Somewhere, a door closes. He doesn't know, he cannot possibly know, that this quiet, golden hour is part of something that will one day be called the greatest financial catastrophe in American history. He knows only that the market was up today, that his clients are content, that the light is beautiful, and the tape is warm in his hands, and the day is almost done. There was another figure who moved through this world with an authority that few could match, though he exercised it so quietly that most Americans never heard his name. His name was Benjamin Strong, and he was the governor of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, not the chairman of the entire Federal Reserve System, but the leader of its most important branch, the one that sat like a fortress at the corner of Liberty Street and Nassau, its massive stone walls housing the largest reserve of gold in the world. Strong was a tall, thin man with a scholar's face and a diplomat's instincts. He had spent years building relationships with the central bankers of Europe, Montague Norman of the Bank of England, Hjalmar Schacht of the German Reichsbank, men who understood, as Strong did, that the financial systems of the world were connected by invisible threads, and that a tremor in one place could be felt everywhere, He believed in low interest rates and easy credit, not out of recklessness, but out of a genuine conviction that the global economy, still fragile from the war, needed to be nurtured, supported, kept in gentle motion. And perhaps he was right. Perhaps his steady hand on the lever of monetary policy helped to sustain the prosperity of the 1920s, helped to keep the great machine humming. But Benjamin Strong died in October of 1928 at the age of 55, worn out by tuberculosis and the long strain of carrying responsibilities that few people even knew existed. He died quietly in a hospital, and the papers noted his passing with respectful brevity. The market barely noticed. The Dow ticked upward the next day, as though nothing had happened. But something had happened. A steadying hand had been removed from the controls, and in the months to come, the machine would begin to move faster and faster, and there would be no one, no single person, no single institution, with quite the knowledge or the authority or the will to slow it down. But that is a story for another chapter. For now, let us stay here, in this quiet, golden autumn. Let us stay in the marble halls and the leather chairs, in the soft clicking of the ticker machines and the amber light that falls through the tall windows of Lower Manhattan. The men in their dark suits move through the corridors with the measured pace of people who believe they are in control of something vast and intricate and fundamentally sound. The numbers on the boards are good. The telephones ring softly and are answered on the first ring. The marble floors gleam, and somewhere, in a brokerage office on the second floor of a building at the corner of Wall and Water, a clerk sits at his desk in the last light of the afternoon, rolling a length of ticker tape between his fingers, not reading it, just feeling the weight of it, the warmth of it, the faint impression of the numbers pressed into the paper. The light is golden. The city is settling into evening, and the clerk, without knowing it, is holding in his hands a thin ribbon of the future, a future that is already being written, line by line, number by number, in a language that no one alive has yet learned how to read. The tape curls softly between his fingers, the light fades, and the city hums on. Chapter 3. A nation of speculators. Now let us leave the city for a while. Let us step out of the marble corridors and the customers' rooms and the shadow of the tall buildings and travel westward, slowly, gently, the way a train moves through the countryside in the early morning, when the world outside the window is still half asleep and the fields are silver with dew. Because the story of the great speculation was not only a New York story, it was an American story, a story that reached into every town and farmhouse and corner barbershop in the country, the way a song on the radio reaches into every room where the dial is turned. And to understand what happened in the autumn of 1929, you have to understand how deeply, how completely, how tenderly the nation had fallen in love with the idea that the stock market could make ordinary lives extraordinary. Consider a barbershop in Columbus, Ohio. It is a Tuesday afternoon in the spring of 1929, and the shop is warm with the steam from hot towels and the faint, clean scent of bay rum. There are 2 chairs, both occupied. A ceiling fan turns slowly overhead, stirring the air without cooling it. On the wall, between a calendar from a local hardware store and a faded print of a hunting dog, someone has tacked a clipping from the financial pages of the Columbus Dispatch, a chart showing the upward curve of the Dow Jones Industrial Average over the past 12 months. The barber's name is Harold. He is 53 years old. He has been cutting hair in this shop for 21 years. He knows every head in the neighborhood, knows which men part their hair on the left and which on the right, which ones tip generously and which ones don't, which ones talk and which ones prefer to sit quietly with their eyes closed while the scissors do their patient work. He is not a wealthy man. He owns the shop and the small apartment above it, and he drives a 7-year-old Ford that starts on the third try most mornings. But Harold has a secret. Or not a secret exactly. More like a private thrill, a small and glowing ember of excitement that he carries with him through the day. 3 months ago, on the advice of his brother-in-law who works at a bank in Dayton, Harold bought 50 shares of Radio Corporation of America. He bought them on margin, which means he paid for only a portion of their cost and borrowed the rest from his broker, a young man named Davis who has an office above the drugstore on East Broad Street. Harold does not entirely understand how margin works. He knows that he put down $600 of his own money and that the broker lent him the rest. He knows that the stock has gone up since he bought it, and that the number in the little notebook he keeps in his apron pocket is now larger than it was last week. He knows that if the stock keeps going up, he will make money, and that if it goes down, but it won't go down. Everyone says so. His brother-in-law says so. The men in the chair say so. The chart on the wall says so. The line goes up. It has been going up for months. Why would it stop? Harold was not unusual. By the spring of 1929, an estimated 1.5 million Americans owned stocks, a number that sounds modest by today's standards, but was, at the time, extraordinary. A decade earlier, stock ownership had been the province of the wealthy and the professional. Now it belonged to everyone. School teachers, plumbers, ministers, a cattle rancher in Wyoming who had never seen Wall Street and never would, a widow in Baltimore who invested her late husband's insurance money on the recommendation of a neighbor's son, a Pullman porter on the New York Central line who studied the ticker symbols in the back pages of the morning papers during the long stretches between Albany and Buffalo, quietly memorizing the names of companies he would never visit and could barely imagine. They came to the market for different reasons, these millions, but beneath all their reasons lay a single, common impulse. The same impulse that has drawn human beings toward the horizon since the beginning of time. They wanted more. Not more in the sense of greed, though greed was certainly present. More in the sense of hope. More in the sense of a schoolteacher in Kansas who earned $1,800 a year and wondered, watching the numbers climb, whether there might be a way to send her daughter to college after all. More in the sense of a retired postman in Savannah who wanted nothing extravagant, only a new roof for his house, and perhaps a trip to see his grandchildren in Philadelphia before he was too old to make the journey. These were not reckless people. They were cautious by nature and frugal by habit. But the market had a way of making caution feel unnecessary, the way a warm day in February can make you forget, just for an hour, that winter is not over. To understand why so many ordinary Americans place their trust in the stock market, you have to understand a particular invention of the era, an invention as elegant and as fragile as a house of cards. It was called the investment trust. The concept, at first glance, seemed wonderfully simple. An investment trust was a company whose sole purpose was to own shares in other companies. You did not need to know which stocks to buy. You did not need to read the financial pages or understand the difference between a bond and a debenture. You simply bought shares in the trust, and the trust's managers, men of experience and expertise, men who sat in the mahogany offices of Wall Street and knew things that ordinary people did not, would invest your money for you. It was like hiring a guide to lead you through an unfamiliar forest. You didn't need to know the trail. You only needed to trust the guide. And trust they did. Investment trusts multiplied through the late 1920s with the cheerful abundance of dandelions in a spring meadow. In 1927, perhaps 160 such trusts existed. By the end of 1928, the number had swelled to more than 300. By the summer of 1929, new trusts were being formed at the rate of nearly one a day, each one promising safety, diversification, and the steady accumulation of wealth. Their names were reassuring, institutional, solid. The Allegheny Corporation, the United Founders Corporation, the Shenandoah Corporation, the Blue Ridge Corporation. They sounded like mountain ranges and rivers. like features of the American landscape, permanent, immovable, carved from the earth itself. But here is where the story grows quiet and strange, like a path that leads into deeper woods. Many of these trusts did not simply buy stock. They bought shares in other trusts, and those trusts in turn bought shares in still other trusts. The result was a structure of remarkable intricacy, a tower of companies, owning companies, each one balanced on the one below it, like a child's tower of wooden blocks built on a rainy afternoon when there is nothing else to do. And the only question is how high you can go before the whole thing tilts and sways and gently topples. John Kenneth Galbraith, the economist who would later write the definitive history of the crash, compared these structures to the old chain letters that circulated through the postal system, each participant depending on the next, the whole enterprise sustained not by any real creation of value, but by the continuous arrival of new believers. As long as new money kept flowing in, as long as the line on the chart kept rising, the tower stood. It stood because everyone believed it would stand. And belief, for a while, was enough. But belief is not brick, and paper is not stone. And a tower built from confidence alone can only rise so high before it begins to sway in a wind that no one expected and no one can see. There was another mechanism at work in those years, quieter than the investment trust, but in many ways more consequential. It was the practice of buying on margin, and it was the engine that powered the great speculation, the invisible lever that lifted ordinary sums of money into extraordinary ones, and that would, in time, work just as powerfully in reverse. The principle was simple enough to explain over a cup of coffee, and it was explained endlessly in barbershops and living rooms and customers' rooms across the country. If you wanted to buy $100 worth of stock, you did not need $100. You needed only 10, or sometimes 20 depending on the broker. The rest was borrowed. The stock itself served as collateral. As long as the stock went up, you could repay the loan and keep the profit. And if the stock went up by 10%, your profit was not 10% on a $100 investment. It was 100% on a $10 one. The arithmetic was intoxicating. It was the arithmetic of dreams. And there was a catch, of course, though it was spoken of so rarely that many investors barely registered it. If the stock went down, if it dropped below a certain point, the broker would issue what was called a margin call. He would ask the investor to put up more money immediately to cover the loan. And if the investor could not, if the money simply wasn't there, the broker would sell the stock at whatever price the market would bear, and the investor would lose everything. Not just the profit, everything. But stocks didn't go down. Not really. Not for long. Everyone knew that. The chart on the barbershop wall told the story plainly. The line went up. It wobbled sometimes, dipped for a day or a week, but it always came back. It always rose again. And the people believed. And the money flowed in. And the line climbed higher. Let us return for a moment to Harold's barbershop in Columbus. The afternoon light is fading now. The last customer has left, and Harold is sweeping the dark crescent of hair clippings from around the base of the second chair, the bristles of the broom whispering softly against the tile floor. The ceiling fan turns. The radio in the corner plays something slow and sweet. A ballad, perhaps, or a piece of light orchestral music, the kind that fills a room without demanding attention. Harold pauses in his sweeping and glances at the chart on the wall. The line is still going up. He reaches into his apron pocket and takes out the small notebook, flips to the latest page. The numbers are good. Better than good. His 50 shares of RCA are worth more today than they were yesterday, and more yesterday than the day before. He does a calculation in his head, not a precise one, just a rough sketch, a back-of-the-envelope dream. If the stock keeps climbing at this rate, by Christmas he will have enough to pay off the loan on the shop. By next spring, he might have enough for a new car, a real one, a Buick, maybe, or a Chrysler. He slips the notebook back into his pocket and resumes his sweeping. The broom whispers. The radio plays. Outside, the streetlights flicker on, one by one, and the sidewalks of East Broad Street begin their slow transformation from the busy corridors of daytime into the quieter, gentler avenues of evening. A man walks past the shop window with a newspaper tucked under his arm. A dog trots across the street with the unhurried confidence of a creature that knows exactly where it is going. Harold finishes sweeping. He turns off the radio, wipes down the chairs, folds the towels. He takes one last look at the chart. Then he turns off the lights, locks the door, and walks up the narrow staircase to his apartment, where his wife has set the table for dinner, and the kitchen smells of pot roast and boiled potatoes. The plain, warm, enduring smells of a life that has been, until very recently, entirely sufficient. But now there is the notebook in his pocket, and the numbers, and the quiet, persistent dream of something more. Harold is not greedy. He is hopeful. And across America, in a million homes and apartments and rented rooms, a million other Harolds sit down to dinner with the same quiet hope glowing softly in their chests, like the ember of a fire that has been banked for the night but is not quite out. And the market rose, and the people believed. And the spring of 1929 gave way, slowly and warmly, to the longest summer anyone could remember. Chapter 4. The long summer of 1929. Summer. The word itself is a sigh. Say it slowly, and you can almost feel the warmth of it, the way the middle of the word opens up like a window, letting in the light. Summer. It is the season when time itself seems to slow down, when the days stretch out like cats in sunlight, and the evenings linger at the edges of the sky as though reluctant to let go. The summer of 1929 was, by all accounts, a beautiful one. The weather along the eastern seaboard was warm and clear, with long stretches of unbroken sunshine that turned the lawns of Long Island a deep, saturated green, and sent the families of Wall Street north to their summer houses in Connecticut and the Berkshires, where the air smelled of cut grass and lake water and the particular sweetness of a world that felt, for the moment, entirely and permanently at ease. The stock market did not take a summer holiday. It climbed. Day after day, through June and July, and into the heavy, golden heat of August, it climbed. The Dow Jones Industrial Average, which had begun the year at around 300, rose past 320, past 340, past 350. Each new number was reported in the papers with a calm that bordered on boredom, the way a weather report notes another sunny day. Of course, the market was up. The market was always up. That was simply what the market did. The trading volume on the New York Stock Exchange reached levels that would have been unimaginable a year earlier. On some days, 5 million shares changed hands, a number so large that the ticker tape machines, those faithful little printers that had served the financial world for decades, began to fall behind. By the time the last transaction of the day had been printed on the narrow ribbon of paper, the market had already closed, and the prices on the tape were ghosts, echoes of a reality that had moved on without them. No one seemed to mind. The lag was treated as a minor inconvenience, a charming imperfection in an otherwise flawless system, like a crack in the plaster of a grand and beautiful house. Someone would fix it eventually. In the meantime, the numbers were good, and the sun was shining, and there were more important things to think about, like which stock to buy next. The voices of reassurance were everywhere that summer, as reliable as the sunrise, and nearly as warm. They spoke from the pages of newspapers, and from the podiums of luncheon clubs, and from the leather chairs of brokerage offices, and what they said, in 100 different ways, was always the same. All is well. The fundamentals are sound. The economy is strong. There is no reason to worry. Irving Fisher was perhaps the most prominent of these voices. A professor of economics at Yale University, Fisher was a man of considerable intellect and absolute conviction. He was tall, austere, and impeccably dressed, with the bearing of a man who has never in his life been wrong about anything important. In the late summer of 1929, Fisher made a pronouncement that would follow him for the rest of his career and well beyond it. He declared that the stock market had reached what he called a permanently high plateau. The phrase is worth lingering on because it tells us something important about the texture of belief in those days. Fisher did not say the market would keep rising. He said it had arrived, that it had reached a destination, a place of stability from which it would not descend. The image is geographic, almost geological. A plateau, flat and solid, stretching out in every direction beneath a clear sky. A place where you could set down your bags, unroll your map, and breathe easily, because the climbing was over. You had arrived. The view from here was magnificent, and it was permanent. Fisher was not a fool. He was, by many measures, one of the most brilliant economists of his generation, a man who had made real contributions to the understanding of money and debt and the behavior of prices. But brilliance is no armor against the mood of an era. And the mood of the summer of 1929 was so thoroughly optimistic, so saturated with confidence, that even the most careful minds found themselves floating along with the current, like leaves on a slow and pleasant river, carried gently toward a waterfall they could not yet hear. There were other voices too, quieter ones, voices that spoke not from podiums, but from the margins, from the edges of the conversation where they could be easily overlooked. Roger Babson was one of them. A financial commentator with a loyal but modest following, Babson had been warning about the market for years, so long in fact, that most people had stopped listening. He was the man who cried wolf, the dinner guest who always brought up unpleasant subjects, the relative who could be counted on to dampen any celebration with a reminder that nothing good lasts forever. In September, he would make a prediction that briefly rattled the market. But in the summer, his warnings were like clouds on the far horizon, visible if you looked, but easy to dismiss as someone else's weather. Paul Warburg, one of the founders of the Federal Reserve System, also sounded a note of caution. In March of 1929, he had publicly warned that the orgy of speculation, if left unchecked, would lead to a collapse that would affect the entire nation. The market had shrugged. Warburg's words had been reported in the papers, discussed over lunch, and then set aside, like an umbrella on a sunny day. He was respected, certainly, but he was also, in the view of many, simply wrong. The evidence was right there on the ticker tape, in black ink on white paper. The market was going up, and up, and up. Let us pause here and rest for a moment. Let the story settle, like dust in a beam of afternoon light. Imagine that you are sitting on the porch of a house in the Connecticut countryside. It is a Saturday in late July, 1929. The house belongs to someone important, perhaps a banker or a lawyer, or the president of a small manufacturing firm. But it doesn't matter who. What matters is the porch, and the view from it, and the feeling of the wooden boards beneath your chair, worn smooth by years of feet and weather. The lawn slopes gently away from the house toward a row of elm trees, their leaves dark and heavy with the fullness of midsummer. Beyond the elms, a meadow. Beyond the meadow, a low stone wall, and beyond the wall, the soft blue ridgeline of distant hills. The air is warm and still. A bee drifts past. Somewhere in the house, a screen door closes with a gentle slap. On the wicker table beside your chair, there is a glass of lemonade, half finished, the ice nearly melted. Beside it, a copy of the Saturday Evening Post, open to a page you were reading before the warmth and the stillness and the slow turning of the afternoon carried you somewhere else. Not quite sleep, but close to it. That pleasant, drifting place where thoughts lose their edges and blend into one another like watercolors on wet paper. This is what the summer of 1929 felt like, for those who were fortunate enough to sit on porches and drink lemonade and watch the hills. It felt safe. It felt earned. It felt like the natural reward for years of hard work and sound judgment and careful investment. The market was up. The children were healthy. The house was paid for, or would be soon, once the stocks matured a little further. And the afternoon stretched out before them, long and golden and unhurried, with no particular destination and no reason to move. But beneath the porch, in the cool, dark space where the spiders built their webs and the fieldstones held the dampness of the earth, something was shifting. Not dramatically, not suddenly, just a faint, almost imperceptible movement, like the first tremor before an earthquake, that no seismograph is sensitive enough to record. Industrial production, that reliable barometer of the economy's health, had begun to slow. Not plummet, not collapse, just ease, gently, the way a car eases off the accelerator on a long, flat highway. Factory orders dipped slightly. Construction contracts leveled off. The number of freight cars loaded with goods for shipment, a statistic that economists watch the way farmers watch the sky, ticked downward by a fraction of a percent. None of this was alarming. None of it made the front pages. It was the kind of data that lived in the back sections of the financial papers, in small type, surrounded by advertisements for bond offerings and life insurance. You had to look for it to find it, and almost no one was looking. Why would they? The market was up. The sun was shining. The lemonade was cold. Andrew Mellon, the Secretary of the Treasury, saw no cause for concern. Mellon was 74 years old, one of the richest men in America, and a man whose faith in the self-correcting wisdom of free markets was as deep and as unshakable as his faith in God. He had served under 3 presidents, Harding, Coolidge, and now Hoover, and through all those years he had maintained a single, consistent philosophy. The economy, left to its own devices, would find its balance. Interference was not only unnecessary, it was dangerous. The market knew what it was doing. The market always knew. Herbert Hoover, the new president, was a different kind of man. An engineer by training and a humanitarian by instinct, Hoover had spent the war years organizing the feeding of starving Europeans, a vast, complex logistical effort that had earned him the admiration of the world and the nickname, the Great Humanitarian. He was methodical, earnest, and deeply competent. He believed in data, in organization, in the power of rational planning to solve any problem. And he was not, privately, entirely comfortable with the speculative frenzy that had overtaken the country. But Hoover was also new to office and cautious by temperament, and reluctant to say or do anything that might disturb the delicate machinery of confidence that kept the economy running. So he said nothing. Or rather, he said what every president says when the numbers are good and the public is happy. He expressed confidence. He praised the resilience of American enterprise. He smiled for the cameras and shook the hands that were offered to him, and if he felt, in the quiet of his study late at night, a faint unease, a nagging sense that something in the machinery was not quite right, he kept it to himself, the way a man keeps a troubling dream to himself, because speaking it aloud might somehow make it real. August faded. The days grew shorter by a few minutes each week, though the change was so gradual that you noticed it only in retrospect. The way you notice, looking at an old photograph, that someone you love has aged. The shadows on the lawn reached a little further each evening. The light through the elm trees shifted from white to gold to a deeper, more ambiguous amber. The air lost its heaviness and began to carry, on certain mornings, the faintest suggestion of something cooler, something sharper, something that smelled of apples and wood smoke and the turning of the year. September arrived the way it always does in the northeastern states, not announced but implied, like the first movement of a symphony that begins so softly you aren't sure at first whether the music has started or whether you are simply remembering music you heard before. The children went back to school. The summer houses were closed up, the shutters latched, the porch furniture carried inside. The bankers and the lawyers and the presidents of small manufacturing firms returned to their offices in the city, their faces tanned, their spirits refreshed, their briefcases full of papers they had not quite gotten around to reading. And the market, the great, tireless, ever-climbing market, was waiting for them. It had not paused. It had not rested. Through all the long, lazy weeks of summer, while they drank their lemonade and watched the hills, it had gone on ticking and printing and climbing, faithful as a clock, steady as a heartbeat, persistent as a vine growing up the side of a house in the dark. On September 3rd, 1929, the Dow Jones Industrial Average reached its highest point. 381. It was a number that would not be seen again for 25 years. But no one knew that. No one could have. The number appeared on the ticker tape and on the blackboards of the customers' rooms, and it was noted in the evening papers, and perhaps a few people paused to appreciate the milestone, the way you might pause at the top of a hill to admire the view. But there was no ceremony. No bell was rung. No speech was given. The market closed for the day, and people went home, and the city settled into the warm, familiar rhythms of evening, dinner and conversation, and the murmur of radios playing through open windows. And the night was quiet, and the stars came out, and the world turned slowly toward October. Rest here for a moment. Let the summer hold you. Feel the warmth of it, the stillness, the gentle weight of an afternoon that doesn't want to end. There is no hurry. The autumn will come. It is already coming, already gathering itself in the cool mornings and the lengthening shadows, and the first yellow leaves appearing one by one on the maples along the quiet streets of 1,000 American towns. But not yet, not just yet. For now the lemonade is still cold, and the porch is still warm, and the hills are still blue in the distance, and the line on the chart is still climbing, and the people still believe, and the summer, the long, golden, impossible summer of 1929, goes on, and on, and on. Chapter 5. The first chill of autumn October. The word arrives like a change in the weather. You feel it before you name it. A shift in the quality of the air, a thinning of the light, a new crispness at the edges of the morning that wasn't there the week before. October is the month when the world begins to let go. The leaves release their grip on the branches. The afternoons surrender their warmth an hour earlier each day. The sky, which all summer long was a flat, confident blue, deepens into something more complex, streaked with silver, touched with violet, carrying the faint, high haze that comes when the angle of the sun drops just enough to remind you that time is passing, always passing, and that nothing, not even the longest and most golden of summers, can last forever. The first sign that something had changed came quietly, almost apologetically, the way a guest clears his throat before delivering unwelcome news. On September the 5th, 1929, just 2 days after the Dow had reached its all-time high, a financial commentator named Roger Babson stood before a gathering of businessmen at a luncheon in Wellesley, Massachusetts, and made a prediction. The market, he said, was headed for a crash. Not a dip, not a correction, a crash. And when it came, he warned, it would be terrible. The market dipped that afternoon. Not dramatically. The Dow fell about 3%, but enough to notice, the way you notice when the music at a party suddenly stops and the room goes quiet for a beat before someone puts on another record. The newspapers called it the Babson break. By the following day, the market had largely recovered, and Babson himself was dismissed with the gentle condescension reserved for prophets who have been predicting rain for so long that no one listens anymore. even when the clouds begin to gather. But the clouds were gathering, slowly, almost imperceptibly, like the first wisps of fog that drift in off the harbour on an autumn evening, so thin at first that you can see right through them, so gradual that you don't realise the world has changed until you look up and find that the familiar landmarks have softened and blurred and begun, very quietly, to disappear. September passed. The market moved sideways, like a man pacing in a waiting room, not going anywhere in particular, just moving, restless, uncertain. Some days it rose, some days it fell. The rises were greeted with relief, the falls with a nervous optimism that sounded to certain ears slightly different from the genuine article. The words were the same. All is well, the fundamentals are sound. This is merely a healthy correction. But the music beneath the words had shifted by half a tone, the way a familiar melody sounds different when played in a minor key. The customers' rooms were still full. The chairs were still occupied. The ticker tape still clicked and curled. But there was something new in the air. Not panic, not even worry. Just a faint alertness. The way a dog lifts its head from the carpet when it hears a sound too far away and too soft for its owner to notice. Something had moved in the underbrush. Something was different. No one could say exactly what. The leaves turned. That is what happens in October in the northeastern states. And it happened in 1929, the same way it happens every year. Slowly at first. A single branch on a single maple, going from green to gold while the rest of the tree holds on. And then faster, day by day, until the hillsides are ablaze with colour and the sidewalks are carpeted with leaves that rustle underfoot like whispered secrets. In New York, the change of season was visible even in the financial district, where nature made its presence felt in small, persistent ways. A yellowing leaf caught in the grating of a subway entrance, a gust of cooler air sweeping down Broadway and lifting the hats of men walking to their offices. The mornings arrived later. The shadows of the tall buildings reached further across the narrow streets, so that by mid-October, the trading floor of the New York Stock Exchange, with its high-arched windows, received direct sunlight only in the early afternoon, and even then it fell in thin, angular shafts that moved across the floor like the hands of a slow clock. The market continued its uneasy drift. On some days it rallied, and the voices of reassurance spoke with their old conviction, and the customers in the brokerage offices leaned back in their chairs and felt the familiar warmth of confidence returning. On other days it slipped, and the voices grew quieter, and the customers leaned forward, watching the numbers on the board with an attention that was new and not entirely comfortable. The brokers noticed. They were attuned to these shifts the way a sailor is attuned to changes in the wind, not because they could see the wind itself, but because they could see what it did to the surface of the water. And the surface of the market, in those early weeks of October, had developed a chop, a roughness, a pattern of small, irregular waves that suggested something was stirring below. Margin calls began to appear. Not many, not yet. But here and there, in brokerage offices across the country, a clerk would receive instructions to contact a customer and inform him, politely but firmly, that his account had fallen below the required margin and that additional funds were needed. The calls were made discreetly, almost apologetically. The sums involved were usually small. The customers, for the most part, paid up without complaint, dipping into savings accounts or borrowing from relatives, patching the small holes in their positions the way a homeowner patches a leak in the roof before the rain gets worse. No one thought of it as rain. Not yet. It was simply autumn, a natural shift, a seasonal adjustment. The market breathed in, and the market breathed out. And if the breathing seemed a little shallower than usual, a little more rapid, well, that was only to be expected. Markets, like people, have their anxious days. In Washington, the men who were supposed to understand these things watched with varying degrees of attention. The Federal Reserve Board, that committee of quiet, cautious men who controlled the nation's money supply from a building on Constitution Avenue, had been concerned about speculation for some time. They had raised interest rates, gently, hoping to cool the market without damaging the broader economy. It was the monetary equivalent of turning down the flame beneath a pot of water that was beginning to bubble, a precise and delicate operation that required, above all, a steady hand. But the hand was no longer as steady as it had been. Benjamin Strong, the man who had held the financial system together through force of intellect and quiet persuasion, was dead. His successors lacked his authority, his relationships, his instinct for the subtle adjustments that kept the machinery in balance. They disagreed among themselves. They issued statements that were carefully worded and widely ignored. They watched the ticker tape and the morning papers and each other. And they waited, the way people wait when they sense that something is about to happen, but cannot quite bring themselves to act. Because acting would mean admitting that the situation is serious. And admitting that the situation is serious would mean disturbing the peace, and the peace, for the moment, still held. October 15th passed. Then the 16th. The 17th. The market drifted lower, but without drama, without headlines. The declines were modest. A point here, 2 points there. And they were scattered among enough small rallies and sideways days to maintain the illusion that nothing fundamental had changed. The customers' rooms were still warm and well lit. The ticker tape still clicked. The leather chairs were still comfortable. But the light through the tall windows was different now. It came in at a lower angle, and it was thinner, and it had a quality that was hard to describe. Not cold, exactly, but cooler, more provisional, as though the sun itself had grown uncertain of its welcome. The shadows were longer. The days were shorter. And somewhere, in the back of the mind, in that quiet room where the things we don't want to think about sit patiently waiting to be thought. Somewhere, very quietly, a question was forming. What if the line on the chart, the one that had been climbing so steadily and so faithfully for so long, what if it stopped climbing? What if it turned? What if the permanent plateau was not, after all, permanent? The question floated in the autumn air, like a leaf that has separated from its branch, but has not yet reached the ground. It hung there, suspended, slowly turning, and the city went on. And the ticker tape clicked, and the leaves fell, one by one, from the maples and the elms, settling softly on the sidewalks and the windowsills and the shoulders of men who walked with their heads down and their collars turned up against the first real chill of the season. October had arrived, and it was waiting. Chapter 6. The week, the music, slowed. The week began on a Monday. They always do. But this particular Monday, October 21st, 1929, arrived with a heaviness that was hard to place, the way certain mornings carry a weight that has nothing to do with the weather, and everything to do with the feeling that the world has shifted slightly on its axis overnight, and that the day ahead will not be quite like the ones that came before. The market opened. It fell. Not sharply, not yet, but with a steady, downward pressure that was new in its persistence. Sell orders arrived from across the country in numbers that the clerks on the trading floor had not seen before. The ticker tape, that faithful little machine, began to fall behind. By mid-morning, the prices it printed were already several minutes old. Small ghosts of transactions that had already been completed, like the light of stars that have already moved on. Tuesday brought a partial recovery, and the voices of reassurance stirred themselves again, like a choir that has lost its place in the hymnal, but finds it just in time. The market was simply correcting, they said. This was healthy. This was normal. The fundamentals remained sound. Charles Mitchell, the president of National City Bank, told reporters that the situation was not serious enough to warrant concern. His words were reported in the evening papers, and people read them over dinner, and some of them felt reassured, and some of them did not, and all of them went to bed that night in a world that was not quite the same as the one they had woken up in. Wednesday was quiet. A pause. A held breath. The market neither rose nor fell with any conviction. It drifted, like a boat that has lost its mooring and is waiting for the tide to carry it somewhere, anywhere, so that the waiting can end. And then came Thursday, October 24th, 1929. Black Thursday. A day that would be remembered long after the men who lived through it had gone to their rest, long after the buildings they worked in had been renovated or demolished, long after the ticker-tape machines had been replaced by screens and the leather chairs by ergonomic swivel seats. A day that entered the language and stayed there, the way certain dates do. Not because of what happened in the hours between sunrise and sunset, but because of what those hours came to represent in the long, slow story of how human beings relate to money and hope, and the fragile architecture of their own confidence. But we will not rush toward it. Let us approach this day the way you might approach a large old building at dusk. Slowly, from the outside, taking in the shape of it before stepping through the door. The morning of October 24th was cool and overcast. A thin layer of cloud covered the sky above Manhattan, turning the light a flat, even grey. The kind of light that erases shadows and makes everything look slightly closer than it is, slightly more present, as though the city had been printed on paper rather than built from stone. The trading floor of the New York Stock Exchange opened at 10 o'clock, as it always did, with the ringing of the brass bell. But within the first few minutes, it became clear that this morning would be different. Sell orders poured in. Not a stream, a flood. They came from everywhere. From brokerage offices in New York and Boston and Chicago and San Francisco, from small-town banks and big city firms, from individual investors and institutional funds, from people who had been holding on and had finally decided, all at once and without any coordinating signal, that it was time to let go. The floor erupted, not into panic. That word is too sharp, too sudden for what actually happened. What happened was more like a river overflowing its banks. The water rises. You watch it. You know it is rising. But there is nothing you can do to stop it, and the only question is how high it will go and how long it will take to recede. The ticker tape fell behind almost immediately. By 10:30, it was printing prices that were already ancient history. By 11, the lag had stretched to more than 15 minutes, and the numbers on the tape bore no relation to the numbers on the trading floor. The customers in the brokerage offices across the country sat in their leather chairs and watched the tape and did not know, could not know, what their holdings were actually worth at that moment. They were reading yesterday's weather report in the middle of a storm. Imagine the scene, if you can, not as chaos, but as a kind of strange, slow-motion choreography. Hundreds of men moving across the trading floor, their voices blending into a single, sustained roar that was not angry and not frightened, but simply enormous. The sound of a great many people trying to be heard at the same time. Pages ran between the posts with slips of paper. Clerks scribbled numbers on pads. The pneumatic tubes that carried orders from the telephone rooms to the floor hissed and thumped with a steady, mechanical urgency. And above it all, the indicator boards on the trading posts ticked downward, number by number, like a slow and patient countdown. Outside on Broad Street, a crowd had begun to gather. They stood on the sidewalk and looked up at the windows of the exchange, as though the building itself might offer some explanation. They were quiet mostly. A few spoke in low voices. Some held newspapers folded under their arms. A policeman stood at the corner, his hands behind his back, watching the crowd with the patient, impassive expression of a man who has seen many crowds and knows that the important thing is not what they do, but what they decide not to do. No one shouted, no one ran. They simply stood and waited and watched the windows, and the windows, grey and featureless, told them nothing. At noon, or near enough to noon that the distinction scarcely matters, a group of men gathered at 23 Wall Street, the offices of J.P. Morgan and Company. The building was modest by the standards of the financial district, only 4 stories tall, with a plain limestone facade that gave no hint of the power that resided within. But it was, in many ways, the true center of American finance, the place where the most important decisions had been made for half a century, and the men who gathered there that Thursday afternoon were among the most powerful bankers in the country. Thomas Lamont of J.P. Morgan, Albert Wiggin of Chase National Bank, Charles Mitchell of National City Bank, William Potter of the Guarantee Trust Company, Seward Prosser of Bankers Trust. They arrived separately, entering through the front door with the unhurried dignity of men who understand that to appear rushed is to appear frightened, and to appear frightened is to make things worse. The meeting was brief, perhaps 20 minutes. When it was over, Thomas Lamont stepped outside to speak with the reporters who had gathered on the sidewalk. He was a tall man with a thin face and an air of unflappable calm, and he chose his words with the precision of a surgeon choosing his instruments. The situation, he said, was not as serious as it might appear. There had been some distress selling, but the market was fundamentally sound. The bankers had agreed to provide support. The word went out. The bankers were stepping in. The weight of their combined resources, their names, their reputations, the vast reserves of capital they commanded, would be placed beneath the market like a floor, preventing any further fall. And then, at approximately 1:30 in the afternoon, a single figure walked onto the trading floor of the New York Stock Exchange. His name was Richard Whitney. He was the vice president of the exchange, a tall man with broad shoulders and the confident bearing of someone who has never doubted his right to be in any room he enters. He walked to the post where United States Steel was traded. Walked, not ran, not hurried. And in a voice loud enough to be heard above the noise, he placed an order. He bid $205 for 10,000 shares of U.S. Steel. The last price had been $193.50. The floor fell quiet. Not silent, a trading floor is never silent, but quieter. The roar subsided into a murmur, the way a wave subsides as it spreads across the sand. Whitney moved to the next post, and the next, placing large orders for stock after stock, each bid above the current market price, each one a small act of theatre designed to communicate a single, unmistakable message. We are here. We are not afraid. The floor is solid. And for a while it worked. The market steadied. Some stocks recovered part of their losses. The crowd on Broad Street, sensing that the crisis had passed, began to thin. The afternoon light, which had been grey and flat all day, softened toward evening, and the city exhaled, a long, slow breath of relief that you could almost hear, like the sound the wind makes when it finally dies down after a long and restless night. The closing bell rang at 3 o'clock. The ticker tape did not catch up until after 4. When the final numbers were tallied, the losses for the day were significant but not catastrophic. The system had held. The bankers had intervened. Richard Whitney had walked onto the floor and placed his bids, and the market had responded, the way a child responds to the calm voice of a parent in the dark. Not because the danger is gone, but because someone is there, and the sound of that presence is, for the moment, enough. People went home that evening with a cautious sense of relief. The crisis, they told themselves, was over. The worst had passed. The bankers were in control. The words that Thomas Lamont had spoken on the sidewalk outside 23 Wall Street, fundamentally sound, distress selling, not as serious, as it might appear. These words settled over the city like a blanket, warm and heavy and comforting, and the people pulled them close, and they rested. The night was quiet. The streets were empty. The ticker tape machines stood still in the darkened offices, their glass domes gleaming faintly in the light from the street lamps outside. And in the barber shop in Columbus, Ohio, Harold checked his notebook one last time before turning off the lamp beside his bed. And the numbers were down. Yes, but not terribly, not irreversibly. And his wife was asleep beside him, and the house was warm. And tomorrow, surely, things would be better. He closed the notebook. He closed his eyes. And the city, and the country, and the whole fragile, complicated, beautiful structure of belief that had been built over the course of a decade, all of it rested for one more night on the strength of the floor that the bankers had promised to provide. But floors, like promises, are only as strong as the weight they are asked to bear, and the weight was growing. Chapter 7. Black Tuesday. 5 days passed. They passed the way days pass in October, quickly, each one a little shorter than the one before, the darkness arriving earlier, the mornings arriving later, the space between them narrowing like the pages of a book you are almost finished reading. Friday was uneasy. Saturday, the exchange still opened on Saturday mornings in those years, was worse. Monday brought fresh selling, heavy and persistent, and the ticker tape fell behind again, and the bankers met again, and the voices of reassurance spoke again. But the words had a different quality now. Thinner, more strained, like a rope that has been pulled too tight and has begun, in the fibers you cannot see, to fray. And then came Tuesday, October 29th, 1929. Let us be quiet for a moment. Let us approach this day, not with the urgency of a newsreel or the drama of a headline, but with the gentle, unhurried attention of someone looking at an old photograph, studying the faces, noticing the light, wondering what the people in the picture were thinking in the moment before the shutter clicked. The morning was grey. The sky above Manhattan was the colour of pewter, low and featureless, pressing down on the rooftops and the water towers and the stone angels perched on the cornices of buildings they had been watching over for 40 years. The air was cool, not cold. Autumn had not yet deepened into anything that required more than a light coat, but cool enough to make your hands seek the warmth of your pockets, cool enough to see, just barely, the faint vapour of your own breath in the early light. The trading floor opened at 10 o'clock. The bell rang. And what happened next was unlike anything that had happened before. Sell orders arrived in a torrent. Not a flood this time. A torrent, a cataract, a volume of selling so vast and so sudden that the machinery of the exchange, both human and mechanical, was overwhelmed within minutes. The ticker tape fell behind immediately and never caught up. By mid-morning, it was running more than an hour late, printing prices that belonged to another world, the world of 90 minutes ago, which was already as distant and as irretrievable as last year. 16 million shares would change hands before the day was over. 16 million. The number is difficult to hold in the mind, difficult to translate into anything tangible. So let us try. Imagine 16 million slips of paper, each one representing a transaction, a buyer, a seller, a price, a moment. Imagine them laid end to end, stretching from the trading floor of the New York Stock Exchange to somewhere far beyond the city, far beyond the state, out into the countryside where the fields are brown and the trees are bare, and no one has heard the news yet. That is how many hands reached out that day to let go. But we will not dwell on the numbers. Numbers are the scaffolding of this story, not its substance. The substance is quieter than that. It lives in the spaces between the transactions, in the moments when the noise of the trading floor fades to a distant hum. And you can see, if you look carefully, the individual human beings moving through the wreckage of their own expectations. A broker stands at his post near the center of the floor. He is 41 years old. He has been working on the exchange for 16 years. He has seen busy days before, days when the volume was high and the noise was deafening and the pace was relentless. But he has never seen anything like this. The orders are coming in faster than he can process them. His pad is full. His pencil is blunt. His voice, which has been shouting bids and offers since 10 o'clock, has gone hoarse and thin, like a radio turned down to the edge of audibility. He pauses for a moment. Just a moment. He lifts his head and looks around. The floor is a sea of movement. Men in dark jackets moving between the posts, their arms raised, their mouths open, their faces flushed with effort and something else. Not fear exactly, but a kind of bewilderment, the expression of people who are working very hard at something they no longer entirely understand. Paper litters the floor, order slips, ticker tape, the small yellow sheets on which the specialists record their transactions. The paper is ankle deep in places, drifting against the bases of the trading posts like leaves against a curb. The broker drops his gaze back to his pad. He has work to do. He picks up his pencil, finds a fresh page, and returns to the business of buying and selling small pieces of a world that is quietly rearranging itself beneath his feet. Outside, the crowd on Broad Street had returned, larger now than on Thursday. Quieter too. They stood in the grey light and looked up at the building, and the building looked back at them with its blank, expressionless windows, and neither side had anything useful to say to the other. A few reporters moved through the crowd, notebooks in hand, looking for quotes, for stories, for some human detail that might help them explain to their readers what was happening behind those windows. A photographer set up his tripod on the sidewalk and pointed his camera at the facade of the exchange, and the shutter clicked, and the moment was preserved. 100 people standing in silence, looking at a building, waiting for news that no one wanted to deliver. Someone noticed something strange. A workman had appeared on the roof of a building nearby, apparently to make some routine repair. From the street, it was impossible to tell what he was doing. But in the atmosphere of the day, his presence on the rooftop drew attention, and a murmur went through the crowd, a ripple of unease, a momentary misunderstanding that was corrected almost as quickly as it arose, but that lingered afterward as a measure of how frayed the city's nerves had become. He was just a workman, fixing a pipe, or checking an antenna, or doing whatever workmen do on rooftops on Tuesday mornings when the world below them is coming apart at the seams. He finished his work and went back inside, and the crowd returned to its vigil, and the grey sky pressed down, and the minutes passed. Inside the exchange, the day wore on. The noise rose and fell in waves, like the breathing of some enormous, exhausted animal. The ticker tape machines clicked and chattered, printing their obsolete dispatches. The pneumatic tubes hissed. The telephones rang and rang and rang, a ceaseless, overlapping chorus of ringing that the clerks in the telephone rooms would later say was the sound they remembered most clearly, the sound that stayed with them longest, the sound they heard in their dreams for weeks afterward. The ringing of telephones that could not all be answered, each one carrying a voice from somewhere else in the country, asking the same question in 100 different ways. What is happening? No one had a complete answer. The traders on the floor knew only their own small section of the market. The clerks at the ticker tape machines knew only the numbers that scrolled past their eyes, already outdated. The bankers in their offices knew what their own firms were doing, but not what the others were doing. And the customers, the school teachers and the barbers and the retired postmen scattered across the country in their brokerage offices and their living rooms. They knew least of all. They knew only the feeling. And the feeling was that the ground beneath them, which had seemed so solid for so long, was no longer quite as firm as it had been. The bankers met again, this time at 23 Wall Street, as before. But the meeting was different. On Thursday, they had pledged to support the market, to place their combined resources beneath it like a net. Today, the understanding was quieter, grimmer. The net had not held. The weight was too great. The selling was too vast, too dispersed, too fundamental to be stopped by any group of men, however powerful, however well-intentioned. Thomas Lamont spoke to reporters again that afternoon. His words were measured as always, but they carried a new note. Not panic. Lamont was incapable of panic, but something closer to honesty. The bankers, he said, had not set out to maintain any particular level of prices. They had sought only to maintain an orderly market. An orderly market. The phrase was a retreat disguised as a clarification, a quiet acknowledgement that the floor they had promised to provide was not, after all, a floor at all. It was a suggestion, a hope, a polite request to gravity that it might, this once, make an exception. Gravity did not oblige. The closing bell rang at 3 o'clock. The ticker tape did not catch up until 7:30 that evening, more than 4 hours after the market had closed. In the intervening hours, the clerks and the brokers and the office boys stayed at their desks and their posts, tallying the damage by the light of desk lamps while the city outside went dark and quiet, and the cleaning women waited in the hallways, and the night watchmen made their rounds, and the last of the crowd on Broad Street dispersed into the October evening, their footsteps fading on the pavement like the last notes of a song no one had asked to hear. The losses were immense. Billions of dollars in value had evaporated, not destroyed exactly, because the money had never been entirely real. It had existed as numbers in ledgers and on ticker tape, as entries in notebooks kept in apron pockets, as the difference between what a stock was bought for and what it could be sold for. And now that difference had collapsed, and the numbers had changed, and the world was recalibrated, and the people who had believed so deeply and so tenderly and for so long, the people were left holding the paper, and the paper was lighter than they remembered, and the ink was already fading. Let us not linger here. Let us not count the losses or name the fallen. That is not the work of this particular story, and you, listening in the quietness of your room, do not need to carry those numbers to sleep. Instead, let us notice something smaller, something gentler. Let us notice the way the evening light falls through the windows of a brokerage office on the second floor of a building at the corner of Wall and Water, where a clerk, the same clerk perhaps, whom we met many chapters ago, sits at his desk in the half-dark, not working, not moving, simply sitting. His jacket is draped over the back of his chair. His sleeves are rolled up. On his desk, a pencil lies at an angle across a pad of paper, and beside the pad, a glass of water, untouched, catching the last of the streetlight in a small, steady gleam. He is tired. He has been at his desk since 8 o'clock this morning, and it is now past 7, and the building is quiet, and the ticker tape machine beside him has finally stopped clicking, and the silence, that new, strange, deep silence, is settling over the room like the first snow of winter. He does not understand what has happened. Not fully. Not yet. Understanding will come later, in the weeks and months ahead, when the historians and the economists begin their slow, careful work of sifting through the evidence and constructing their explanations. For now there is only the silence and the fading light, and the feeling, unmistakable, undeniable, that something has ended. He picks up the glass of water and drinks. The water is warm and stale. He sets the glass down. He looks out the window. The street below is empty. The street lamps cast small yellow circles on the pavement. A single taxicab passes, its headlights sweeping briefly across the facade of the building opposite, before disappearing around the corner. He sits for another minute. Then he stands, puts on his jacket, turns off the lamp, and walks through the dark office to the door. His footsteps echo on the marble floor. The building is empty. The elevators are still. He takes the stairs, descending slowly, one flight at a time, his hand on the brass railing, his shadow moving along the wall beside him like a companion who has nothing left to say. He steps outside. The air is cool. The city is quiet. And somewhere, very far away, or perhaps not far at all, perhaps right here, in the space between one heartbeat and the next, the longest summer in American memory has finally, gently, irrevocably come to its end. The night settles. The buildings stand in the dark, their windows dark, their lobbies dark, their marble floors reflecting nothing. The ticker tape lies in soft, motionless piles on the floors of 1,000 offices. The telephones are silent. The city sleeps. And tomorrow will be another day. Not like the ones before. Not like anything before. But a day, all the same. A morning. A light in the east. A bell that will ring. And a floor that will open. And people, tired, shaken, uncertain, but alive, who will return to their desk and their posts and begin slowly, carefully, the long and patient work of learning how to live in a world that has changed. But that is tomorrow's story. For now, the night is here, and the night is quiet, and you are safe. Rest now. Chapter 8. The silence after. The morning after. There is always a morning after. After the argument, after the fever, after the long night when sleep would not come, and the hours moved with the slow, heavy deliberation of clouds crossing a winter sky. There is always a moment when the light returns, not the bold, confident light of a summer noon, but a quieter light, a tentative one, the light of a world that is not sure yet what kind of day it is going to be. The morning after Black Tuesday was a Wednesday, October 30th, 1929. The city woke the way cities always wake, in stages, in layers, starting with the bakeries and the milk wagons and the men who sweep the sidewalks in the hour before the shops open, and then spreading outward, block by block, until the whole vast organism of Manhattan was stirring, blinking, reaching for the morning paper with one hand and the coffee cup with the other. The newspapers told the story in the language of disaster, but the city itself looked the same. The buildings had not moved. The bridges still spanned the rivers. The subway still ran, crowded and rattling, through its tunnels beneath the streets. The pretzel carts were in their usual places. The pigeons strutted along the ledges of the public library with their usual air of civic importance. If you had walked through the streets that morning without reading the headlines, you might not have known that anything had happened at all. But something had happened. You could feel it the way you feel a change in atmospheric pressure. Not with your eyes or your ears, but with something deeper, something in the bones. The air was different. The rhythm was different. The city moved at the same speed, but with a different quality of attention, the way a person moves through a familiar room after the furniture has been rearranged in the dark. The trading floor of the New York Stock Exchange opened again that morning, as it always did, with the ringing of the brass bell. The sound was the same. The bell was the same. But the men who stood on the floor were not quite the same men who had stood there the day before. They were tireder, for one thing. Many of them had worked through the night, tallying the damage, processing the orders that had piled up like drifts of snow in the final hours of trading. Some had slept on cots in the offices of their firms, or not slept at all, sitting in leather chairs with cold cups of coffee balanced on the armrests, staring at columns of numbers that refused to add up to anything resembling the world they had known 24 hours earlier. The market drifted that day. Down a little, up a little. The wild swings of Tuesday had exhausted themselves, the way a storm exhausts itself, leaving behind a strange and disoriented calm. The ticker tape clicked along at a more manageable pace, keeping up with the trading for the first time in days. The customers' rooms, those familiar theatres of hope and anxiety, were quieter than usual. Some chairs were empty. The men and women who sat in the occupied ones did so with a different posture, leaning forward slightly, as though listening for something, though they could not have said what. In the days and weeks that followed, the market continued to fall, but slowly now, without the terrible velocity of late October. It was more like a tide going out than a dam breaking, a steady, patient withdrawal of value that left behind, on the exposed sand, the shapes of things that had been hidden beneath the water for years. The investment trusts, those elegant, intricate structures of companies, owning companies, began to unravel. One by one, they revealed themselves to be lighter than anyone had suspected. The leverage that had multiplied gains on the way up now multiplied losses on the way down, and the towers of paper and confidence that had seemed so solid in the summer sunlight turned out to be, in the cooler light of autumn, precisely what they were. Paper. Confidence. Air. Margin calls arrived in the mail. They came in plain envelopes, typed on plain paper, with the clipped, polite efficiency of a dentist's appointment reminder. Dear Sir, we regret to inform you, your account has fallen below the required margin. Please remit. The language was formal. The consequences were not. Across the country, in kitchens and parlours and the small back offices of family businesses, people opened these letters and sat with them while turning them over in their hands, reading them twice, 3 times, as though a second reading might reveal a different message hidden inside the first. Most of them paid. They found the money somewhere, in savings accounts, in the cash register, in the coffee can under the bed. They paid because they still believed, or because they were afraid, or because paying felt like the responsible thing to do, the way you repair a leak in the roof, even when you suspect that the roof itself may not hold. And some of them could not pay, and their stocks were sold at prices they could not bring themselves to look at, and the notebooks in their apron pockets became souvenirs of a world that no longer existed. Let us visit Harold one last time, not to dwell on his losses. We are not interested in the arithmetic of misfortune, but to notice the way the light falls through the window of his barber shop in Columbus, Ohio, on a Thursday afternoon in the second week of November. The shop is warm. The ceiling fan turns slowly, as it always does. The radio plays. Though Harold has changed the station, he no longer listens to the financial news. He listens to music now, soft orchestral pieces that fill the room without demanding attention. A customer sits in the first chair, his eyes closed, his chin tilted upward, while Harold's scissors make their quiet, rhythmic work along the nape of his neck. Snip, snip, snip. The sound of the scissors is steady and patient and old as the trade itself, and there is a comfort in it that has nothing to do with money and everything to do with the simple, enduring fact that people will always need haircuts and that the man who gives them will always have a place in the world. Harold's notebook is still in his apron pocket. He does not take it out anymore. The numbers inside it are painful now, and there is nothing to be gained by looking at them. The 50 shares of RCA that once made him feel like a man with a secret, a small glowing ember of possibility carried next to his heart. Those shares are worth a fraction of what he paid for them, and the loan from the broker is still owed, and the new car, the Buick, the Chrysler, is a dream that has been quietly folded up and put away, like a letter you meant to send but never did. But Harold is still here. The shop is still open. The scissors still work. His wife has made pot roast for dinner, and the kitchen upstairs smells of gravy and boiled potatoes, and the streetlights on East Broad Street are flickering on in the early darkness, and the world, Harold's world, the real one, the one made of hair clippings and bay rum and the steady rhythm of the scissors, that world is still solid. It is still warm. It is still his. And the market fell, and the people endured, and the autumn deepened into something quieter, something stiller, something that felt less like an ending and more like the pause between chapters in a very long book. Rest here for a moment. Let the stillness settle. The storm has passed. What remains is the gentle, persistent work of going on. The morning coffee, the walk to the office, the folding of the newspaper, the small and unremarkable acts of daily life that continue, as they always do, regardless of what the numbers say, or the headlines shout, or the ticker tape prints in its thin, indifferent ribbon of ink. The world goes on, and the light, though thinner now, still comes. Chapter 9. Voices in the fog. When something very large happens, something that changes the shape of the world, or at least the shape of the world as you understood it, there follows a period of quiet. Not silence, exactly. More like the hush that fills a room after the last note of a piece of music has faded, when the audience has not yet decided whether to applaud or simply to sit with what they have heard. In the weeks and months after the crash, America entered that kind of hush. The newspapers were full of explanations, of course, editorials and analyses, and the wise, measured opinions of men who made their living by explaining things to other people. But beneath the noise of explanation, there was a deeper quiet. The quiet of a nation trying to understand not just what had happened, but what it meant. And that is a different kind of understanding altogether. It is slower. It is softer. It arrives not in a flash of insight, but in the gradual way that fog clears on a winter morning, revealing the landscape one small piece at a time. The explanations, when they came, were as varied as the people who offered them. Some blamed the speculators, the barbers and the shoeshine boys and the school teachers who had wandered into a game they did not understand, driving prices to levels that bore no relationship to the underlying value of the companies whose shares they bought. There was some truth in this, but it was a truth that felt incomplete, the way a map that shows only the roads feels incomplete if you also want to know about the rivers and the mountains and the weather. Some blamed the bankers, the Mitchells and the Wiggins, and the men in the mahogany offices who had sold stocks and bonds to people who could not afford them, who had encouraged speculation because speculation was profitable, who had built the towers of leverage and the pyramids of investment trusts and the whole intricate, dazzling, fatally fragile architecture of borrowed money. There was some truth in this too. But blame, like a stone thrown into water, has to land somewhere, and the ripples it creates often obscure more than they reveal. Some blame the Federal Reserve for keeping interest rates too low for too long, for failing to rein in the speculation when it might still have been reined in, for losing its steadiest hand when Benjamin Strong died, and leaving the controls in the care of men who could not agree on which lever to pull. And some blamed the president, Herbert Hoover, for saying too little too late, for trusting in the self-correcting wisdom of markets that had shown, with devastating clarity, that they were not always wise and did not always correct themselves. But the most honest of the explanations, the one that would endure longest and ring truest in the years to come, was the simplest. It came in time from John Kenneth Galbraith, an economist who had the rare gift of being able to write about money in a way that ordinary people could understand, and who would eventually devote an entire book to the story of the crash, a book that read less like an economic treatise and more like a novel, populated with characters and moods and the small telling details that make history feel like something that happened to real people in real rooms on real afternoons. Galbraith's explanation was not dramatic. It did not point to a single villain or a single cause. Instead, It described a mood, a collective state of mind that had settled over the country like a long, pleasant dream, and that had made it impossible for intelligent people to see what, in retrospect, seemed obvious. The problem, Galbraith suggested, was not that people were stupid or greedy or wicked. The problem was that they were human, and human beings, when they are surrounded by other human beings who all believe the same thing, find it almost impossible to believe anything else. The crash was not caused by a single event. It was caused by a belief. And when the belief broke, everything that had been built on top of it, the trusts and the margin accounts and the permanently high plateaus, broke with it, the way a bridge breaks when the pillar it rests on turns out to be sand. And the belief broke, and the bridge fell, and the people stood on the far side of the river and wondered how they had ever been so certain that it would hold. But let us not stay with the economists and their explanations. Let us drift, instead, into the quieter rooms of history, the rooms where ordinary people sat with their thoughts in the weeks after the crash, trying to make sense of what had happened not to the market, but to themselves. A family sitting at a kitchen table in Brooklyn, the evening paper open between them, the radio murmuring in the next room. The father has lost money. Not everything. He was never deeply invested, but enough to change the feeling of the future, to make the next year look different from the way it looked a month ago. He does not speak about it. His wife does not ask. The children eat their supper and do their homework and go to bed at the usual time, and the house settles into the familiar rhythms of evening, the creak of the stairs, the murmur of a faucet, the soft click of a light being turned off. A shopkeeper standing in his doorway on a quiet street in Richmond, Virginia, watching the last of the afternoon light move across the storefronts opposite. His shelves are full. His customers are fewer. The change has been gradual, a little less foot traffic each week, a few more people lingering over purchases they would once have made without hesitation. He does not know whether this is the crash or merely autumn, whether the slowness is temporary or the beginning of something longer and deeper. He knows only that the light is beautiful, and that the street is quiet, and that he will open the shop again tomorrow, as he always does, and see what comes. In Washington, the conversations were more formal, but no less uncertain. Herbert Hoover held meetings. He consulted advisors. He spoke to business leaders by telephone and in person, asking for their assessments, their recommendations, their plans. He was a man who believed in action, in organization, in the power of assembled expertise to solve any problem. But the problem before him was unlike any he had faced in his long and distinguished career. It was not a bridge to be built or a famine to be fed. It was a mood, a loss of confidence, and confidence, as he was beginning to understand, could not be restored by executive order or engineering skill. It had to return on its own, in its own time, the way sleep returns after a long and anxious night, not because you will it, but because the body, at last, lets go. Hoover issued reassuring statements. He called on business leaders to maintain wages and employment. He projected calm. But behind the calm, in the private hours, he was a man who could see something that many of his contemporaries could not, that the crash was not the disease, it was the symptom. And the disease, the underlying fragility, the overextension of credit, the imbalance between what the economy produced and what the speculators imagined it could produce. That disease was still working its way through the system, quietly, persistently, the way a cold moves through a household, passing from one room to the next. November arrived. Then December. The days grew short and cold. The holiday season came with its lights and its carols and its warm, familiar rituals, and people went about their celebrations with a determination that was, in its own way, a kind of courage. They decorated their trees. They wrapped their gifts. They sat down to dinner with their families and said grace. And what they were grateful for that year was not the abundance of the table or the promise of the new year, but something simpler and more fundamental. That they were here, that the people they loved were here, that the kitchen was warm and the candles were lit, and the darkness outside, however deep, was held at bay for one more evening by the small, steady light of a familiar room. And the fog of explanations drifted through the cities and the towns, and people listened, and some of them understood, and some of them did not, and all of them carried on. Because that is what people do. They carry on. They wake in the morning and put on their shoes and walk out into whatever the day has become, and they do their work. And they come home, and they sit in the quiet of their kitchens, and they breathe. And the fog cleared slowly, and the shapes of things emerged. And the world, though changed, was still recognizable, still inhabited, still, in its battered and uncertain way, beautiful. Chapter 10. The Architecture of Illusion. Let us think for a moment about buildings. Not the buildings of Wall Street. We have spent enough time there, and the marble and the bronze have done their work in your imagination. Let us think instead about buildings in the abstract, about the idea of building, about the human impulse to take raw materials, stone, wood, iron, glass, and arrange them into structures that did not exist before, to create shelter, to create height, to create the feeling, however temporary, of having conquered the fundamental problem of being small in a very large world. The financial system that collapsed in October 1929 was, in its way, a building. Not a building of stone and glass, but a building of belief and paper, of promises and numbers, of the quiet agreements between people who had decided to trust one another with their money and their futures. It was an enormous building. It covered the entire country. Its foundations were sunk into the bedrock of American optimism, and its upper floors reached into the cloudless sky of a decade that had convinced itself that the sky had no limit. And like all buildings, it had an architecture. It had a design, a logic, a set of principles that determined how the weight would be distributed, where the load-bearing walls would go, how high the structure could rise, before the forces of gravity and wind and the inherent limitations of the materials began to assert themselves. The architecture was not evil. That is an important thing to understand, and we should pause on it for a moment, the way you might pause on a park bench to rest and look at the trees. The men who designed the financial system of the 1920s were not villains. They were builders. They were doing what builders have always done, taking the materials available to them and constructing something as tall and as grand as the materials would allow. The problem wasn't that they built. The problem was that they forgot, or perhaps never learned, that every building has a limit, that stone can crack, that iron can bend, that paper, no matter how carefully stacked, is still paper, and that confidence, no matter how widely shared, is still a feeling, and feelings, by their nature, can change. The investment trusts were the most visible expression of this architecture. Picture them, if you will, not as abstract financial instruments, but as physical structures. Towers built from glass and held together by the thinnest of adhesives. Each tower was beautiful in its way, intricate and transparent, catching the light and refracting it into patterns that dazzled the eye. From a distance, they looked solid. Up close, you could see through them. The Goldman Sachs Trading Corporation was one such tower. Formed in December 1928, it had launched with enormous fanfare and the quiet, comforting authority of the Goldman Sachs name. It raised $100 million from investors who trusted that name the way you trust the foundation of a house you have lived in for 20 years. And then the trading corporation created another company, the Shenandoah Corporation, which raised more money. And Shenandoah, in turn, created the Blue Ridge Corporation, which raised still more. Each company owned shares in the one above it and was owned in part by the one below. The structure was a tower within a tower within a tower, like a set of nesting dolls, each one smaller and more fragile than the last. When the market fell, the towers fell with it. The leverage that had amplified gains on the way up now amplified losses on the way down, and the shares of the trusts, those elegant, transparent towers, fell further and faster than the shares of the underlying companies they held. It was the arithmetic of dreams played in reverse, and it was merciless in its symmetry. But architecture is not only about the structures that fall, it is also about the impulse to build again. And here is where the story turns, gently, like a slow river bending toward the sea. Because the people who lived through the crash did not abandon the idea of building. They did not retreat to their barns and their basements and declare that the project of modern finance had been a mistake. Instead, they did what builders have always done when a structure fails. They studied the wreckage. They asked what went wrong. And they began, slowly, carefully, with a new humility and a new respect for the forces they had underestimated, to build again. Let us think about margin for a moment, not the financial concept. We have been through that, but the word itself. Margin. It is a word with many meanings, and all of them are illuminating. The margin of a page is the empty space that surrounds the text, the white border that gives the words room to breathe. The margin of error is the space between what we expect and what actually happens, the acknowledgement that our calculations, however careful, are never quite complete. And the margin of safety is the distance between the edge and the fall, the space that separates confidence from catastrophe. In the 1920s, the margins were thin. The margin between what investors paid and what they owed was thin. The margin between the value of the trusts and the value of the companies beneath them was thin. The margin between the confidence of the era and the reality that supported it was thin. Everything was built close to the edge. And when the edge moved, when the wind shifted, when the tide turned, when the ground beneath the structure proved to be softer than anyone had imagined, there was no space left, no room to breathe, no room to fall without falling all the way down. And the margin was thin, and the people believed, and the tower rose, and the wind blew, and the story, which had seemed so solid and so permanent, revealed itself to be what all stories eventually reveal themselves to be, a structure built from words and numbers and the faith of the people who chose to inhabit it. There is a gentleness in understanding this, not a resignation, but a gentleness. The recognition that human beings build imperfect things, and that the imperfection is not a failure, but a feature, a reflection of the fact that we are finite creatures working with finite materials in a world that is larger and more complicated than any structure we can design. The crash of 1929 was not a punishment. It was not a judgment. It was a correction, a moment when the gap between what people believed and what was actually true became too wide to sustain, and the structure that had been built across that gap gave way. It was painful. It was costly. It changed the lives of millions of people in ways they could not have foreseen and would not have chosen. But it was also, in the long view of history, a kind of education, an expensive one, an education paid for in lost savings and broken dreams and quiet evenings when a barber in Columbus sat in his darkened shop and wondered where the numbers had gone. But the barber was still there, and the shop was still there, and the morning was still coming, and the impulse to build, to hope, to plan, to believe that tomorrow might be a little better than today. That impulse was still there too. It was quieter now, more cautious, more aware of the wind, but it was there. It is always there. It is the most durable thing we have. And now the story grows softer. The pages turn more slowly. The light in the room where you are listening is low, and the night outside is deep, and the words are beginning to drift, the way leaves drift on still water, turning slowly, going nowhere in particular, content simply to float. And the market fell, and the people endured, and the towers, the beautiful, fragile, impossible towers, settled into the landscape of the past, where they rest now, quiet and still, beneath the patient accumulation of years and memory and new growth. And the morning came, as it always does. As it always does. Chapter 11. Letters Never Sent. There are letters that were never sent. In every life, in every era, there are words that were composed in the quiet of a late evening and then folded up and slipped into a drawer, or left on a desk to grow cold overnight, or simply held in the mind like a candle held in cupped hands, glowing, fragile, never quite released into the world. We do not know these letters. They were not preserved. They were not published. They exist only in the space between what people felt and what they found the courage or the occasion to say. But we can imagine them. And imagining, in a story like this one, is a kind of listening, a way of leaning close to the past and hearing, beneath the noise of history, the soft and private voices of the people who lived through it. These letters are not real. Let that be understood from the beginning. They are imagined, gentle fictions, stitched together from the fabric of what we know about the era and the people who inhabited it. They are not meant to deceive. They are meant to accompany you, quietly, as the night deepens and the story draws nearer to its close. A letter from a young clerk in a brokerage office on Wall Street, written in the small hours of a November morning, to a girl he knew in college who now lives in Philadelphia. I have been meaning to write to you for weeks, he begins, but the days have been long and strange, and by the time I sit down at my desk in the evening, the words seem to have gone somewhere I cannot follow. The office is quiet now. Everyone has gone home. There is only the sound of the radiator ticking in the corner and the faint hum of the city outside the window, which is a different kind of hum from the one I remember in the summer. Quieter, thinner, as though the city itself has drawn its coat a little tighter around its shoulders. I do not write to you about the market. You have read the papers. You know the numbers, or at least the shape of them. What I want to tell you is something smaller. This afternoon, as I was walking back from lunch, I stopped at the corner of Broad and Wall and looked up at the sky. It was very blue, a cold, clear blue, the kind you only see in November, when the air has been scrubbed clean by the wind. And I stood there for a moment just looking, and I realized that I had not looked at the sky in weeks. I had been looking at numbers, at ticker tape, at the faces of men who were trying very hard to look as though everything was fine. And the sky had been there the whole time, blue and enormous, and completely indifferent to everything that was happening below it. I found that comforting, somehow. I hope you do too. A letter from a banker's wife in Greenwich, Connecticut, written at the kitchen table after the children have gone to bed, to her sister in Minneapolis. The house is quiet, she writes. Edward came home late again tonight, as he has every night this month. He does not talk about what is happening at the bank, and I do not ask. I have learned over the years that there are things he carries that he prefers to carry alone, and that my job is not to take them from him, but simply to be here when he sets them down. So I wait. I make dinner. I read to the children. I sit in the kitchen after everyone has gone upstairs and listen to the house settle. the creak of the floorboards, the murmur of the pipes, the small, ticking sounds that an old house makes when it is finally at rest. I do not know what will happen. None of us do. But I know that the maple tree in the front yard has lost its leaves, and that the branches against the evening sky look like pencil drawings, delicate and precise, and that tomorrow morning I will rake the leaves into a pile, and the children will jump in them, and their laughter will ring out in the cold, clear air. And that sound, that ordinary, unremarkable, infinitely precious sound, will still be there, regardless of what the market does or does not do. I think that is enough. I think that has to be enough. A letter from a retired schoolteacher in Kansas, written in a notebook that she keeps on the nightstand beside her bed, addressed to no one in particular. I lost $400, she writes. It seems like a small amount, written down like that. $400. I can hold the words in my mouth the way I would hold a pebble, smooth, hard, small enough to swallow if I chose to. But $400 was 3 months of my salary when I was still teaching. It was the trip to California that I have been planning for 6 years. It was the new furnace that the house needs before the worst of winter arrives. It was, in its way, a small piece of my future. And now it is gone, and the future looks different from this side of the loss. Not ruined, not empty, just different, rearranged, like a room after someone has moved the furniture while you are out. I am not angry. I am tired. I am tired the way you are tired after a long walk in the wind, not exhausted, not defeated, just ready to sit down for a while and be still. The wind was strong. It blew from a direction I did not expect, and now it has stopped, and the air is calm, and I am sitting at my desk with my notebook and my lamp, and the lamp makes a small, warm circle of light on the page, and outside the window, the prairie is dark and vast and quiet, and somewhere out there, a long way off, too far to see, the dawn is gathering itself for another day. A letter from a man whose name we do not know, written on the back of a menu at a diner in Pittsburgh, addressed to his father, who died in 1924. You told me once, he writes, that the only money worth having is money you earned with your hands. I did not listen. I thought you were old-fashioned. I thought the world had changed, that there were new ways of building a life, faster ways that did not require the slow, patient accumulation of dollars in a coffee can on a shelf. I thought the numbers on the ticker tape were more real than the calluses on your palms. I was wrong. I know that now. I knew it the moment the broker called and told me that the money was gone. Not gradually, not gently, but all at once, the way a candle goes out when you blow on it. But here is the thing I want you to know, if you can hear me. I am sitting in a diner. It is 11 o'clock at night. The coffee is hot and strong and costs 5 cents. The waitress has a kind face and calls me honey. The counter is clean. The light is warm. And I am still here. I am still here. And the coffee is hot. And outside the window, the streetlights make small yellow pools on the pavement. And the city is quiet. And I am going to finish this cup and walk home and sleep. And tomorrow I am going to get up and find some work to do with my hands, the way you always said I should. I am sorry I did not listen sooner, but I am listening now. These letters were never sent. They live only here, in this story, in the soft space between the words. They are imagined, but the feelings they carry are real as the light from a desk lamp, as real as the sound of a radiator ticking in an empty office, as real as the smell of coffee in a diner at 11 o'clock on a November night. And the people wrote, or they did not write. They thought the words, and the words drifted through their minds like leaves on still water, and the night deepened, and the letters, the real ones, the ones that were never put to paper, settled gently into the silence, where they rest now, quiet and complete, like stones at the bottom of a clear, cold stream. And the night deepened, and the city slept, and the morning came, as it always does, as it always does. Chapter 12. What the river remembers. There is a river. It has been there since before the city, before the streets and the bridges and the marble buildings and the trading floors and the ticker tape machines. It was there before the Dutch sailed into the harbour and gave the island its first European name. It was there before the Lenape walked its banks and fished its shallows and watched the seasons change in the colours of the water. It has always been there, and it will always be there, long after the stories we tell about it have been forgotten and replaced by other stories, which will also be forgotten in their turn. The Hudson, it flows from the north, from the Adirondack Mountains, where it begins as a thin, cold trickle in a lake so small that a child could throw a stone across it. It gathers itself as it moves south, collecting tributaries, widening, deepening, until by the time it reaches the city, it is a broad, slow, tidal estuary, carrying the cold, dark water of the mountains through the canyons of Manhattan and out into the harbour, where it mingles with the salt of the Atlantic and disappears, finally and completely, into the sea. The river saw it all. That is what rivers do. They flow past, and they see, and they carry what they see downstream, into the deeper water, into the wider current, into the ocean of everything that has ever happened, and will ever happen, and is happening now, somewhere, always. The river saw the summer of 1928. It flowed past the construction sites and the crowded piers, past the steamships arriving from Liverpool and Hamburg, past the tugboats and the barges loaded with coal and lumber, and the surface of the water caught the light of the new electric signs on Broadway and carried it southward in long, trembling ribbons of red and gold and white. The river saw the summer of 1929. It flowed past the same piers, the same buildings, but the light was different now, brighter, more insistent, as though the city were burning with a fever it mistook for health. The river carried that light too. It carries everything. It does not judge. It does not choose. It flows. The river saw Black Thursday. It flowed past the crowds on Broad Street, though the crowds could not see the river from where they stood. It flowed past the offices of J.P. Morgan and Company at 23 Wall Street, though the bankers inside were looking at numbers, not water. The river was there, as it always was, grey and patient and unhurried, carrying the cold autumn current southward, carrying the reflection of the overcast sky, carrying the distant sound of the trading floor's roar, muffled by stone and glass, and the sheer weight of everything that was happening inside those walls. The river saw Black Tuesday. It flowed. It did not pause. It did not speed up or slow down. 16 million shares changed hands above its surface, and the river carried the faintest echo of those transactions in the vibrations that travel through stone and earth and water. The imperceptible tremor of a city shaking itself to pieces, felt by the fish and the silt and the deep, slow current, and by nothing else. And the river flows on. It flows past the docks where the ferries come and go. It flows past the Statue of Liberty, that green and patient woman with her torch held high, who has seen everything and is surprised by nothing. It flows past the piers of Brooklyn, where the cables of the Great Bridge hum in the wind, and past the marshes of New Jersey, where the herons stand in the shallows on one leg, perfectly still, perfectly patient, waiting for the silver flash of a fish beneath the surface. The river flows at night. That is when it is most beautiful, and most itself. At night, The surface of the water catches the lights of the city and turns them into something softer, something gentler, a shimmering, shifting mosaic of gold and silver and pale blue that moves and changes with every ripple, every breath of wind, every slow turn of the tide. The lights of the city are hard and bright and fixed, but their reflections on the water are soft and wavering and alive, as though the river were dreaming the city, imagining it, composing it anew with every passing moment. Think of the river now. Let it carry you. It does not ask where you are going. It does not care. It flows, and you float. And the lights of the city drift past like lanterns set adrift on a summer evening, growing smaller and softer and more distant, until they are barely visible, until they are only a faint, warm glow on the horizon, and then not even that, and then only the water and the sky and the slow, steady pulse of the current beneath you, carrying you southward, carrying you gently, carrying you toward the harbour and the open sea and the deep, untroubled darkness where all rivers end and all stories come to rest. The river does not hurry. The river has no schedule, no deadline, no closing bell. It moves at the speed of the earth's turning, at the speed of gravity, at the speed of time itself, which is to say, slowly, patiently, without effort, without anxiety, without the need to arrive. And the water laps, and the lights shimmer, and the current moves, and the city, far behind you now, settles into the hush of its own late hour, its towers dark, its streets quiet, its million windows reflecting nothing but the sky. This is what the river knows. This is what the river has always known. From the first morning of the world to this one, this quiet night, this gentle hour, that everything passes, that the summer passes, and the autumn passes, and the winter passes, and the spring arrives, as it always does, with its green shoots and its birdsong and its patient, unstoppable insistence on beginning again. That the markets rise, and the markets fall, and the people hope, and the people grieve, and the ticker tape prints its thin ribbon of numbers, and the numbers change, and the people change, and the buildings rise, and the buildings crumble, and through it all, beneath it all, the river flows. The river flows. The river flows, and you are floating, and the night is deep, and the water is warm, and the current is gentle, and there is nowhere you need to be, and nothing you need to do, and the only sound is the soft, slow lapping of the water against the hull of this small and ancient boat that has been carrying you all this time, without your knowing, toward the place where the river meets the sea, and the sea meets the sky, and the sky meets the silence, and the silence is complete. Rest now. The river will carry you. Chapter 13. Morning. Will come. Morning. It arrives the way it has arrived for 10,000 years and will arrive for 10,000 more, slowly, gently, without announcement, the darkness thinning at the edges like a curtain drawn back by an unseen hand. First, a faint greyness in the east, barely distinguishable from the night. Then a softening, a warming, a gradual brightening that turns the sky from black to charcoal to slate to the pale, luminous grey of a pearl held up to the light. And then the sun. Not all at once, not in a burst or a blaze, but slowly, steadily, rising from the edge of the world with the patient deliberation of something that has done this before, many times, many millions of times, and knows that there is no need to hurry, because the morning will always come, and the light will always return, and the world, however dark it may have seemed in the hours before dawn, will always open its eyes. And the morning came. as it always does. The morning after, the crash came. The morning after, the week of the crash came. The morning after, the month, and the season, and the year of the crash came. And people woke, and they rose from their beds, and they put on their shoes, and they walked out into the light, whatever kind of light it was, warm or cold, bright or grey, generous or thin, and they began again the work of living. They made breakfast. That is the first thing. In 1 million kitchens across America, in November and December of 1929, people made breakfast. They boiled water for coffee. They cracked eggs into skillets. They sliced bread and placed it in the toaster, and while they waited for the toast, they looked out the window at the morning, and the morning looked back at them, and neither of them spoke, because there was nothing that needed to be said. The toast was ready. The coffee was hot. The children needed to be woken for school, and the day, whatever it would bring, had begun. There is a kind of courage in this that is easy to overlook. It is not the courage of battlefields or rescue missions or dramatic speeches on the floor of Congress. It is the courage of the ordinary, the courage of the schoolteacher who opens her classroom door on a Monday morning in January, knowing that her savings are gone but that the children will still need to learn their multiplication tables. The courage of the shopkeeper who unlocks his store at 8 o'clock, knowing that the customers may not come but that the shelves still need to be dusted and the floor still needs to be swept. The courage of the barber who picks up his scissors and begins, once again, the steady, patient, rhythmic work of cutting hair, because that is what he does, and because the world, however changed, still needs barbers. This is the courage that holds the world together, not the loud kind, the quiet kind, the kind that does not make the newspapers or the history books, but that keeps the lights on and the doors open and the coffee hot and the children's shoes tied and the bills paid, somehow, one way or another, month after month, through the long, uncertain winter and into the slow, reluctant spring. In time, not quickly, not easily, but in time, the country began to mend. Not the market. The market would take years to recover, and the depression that followed the crash would test the nation in ways that no one standing in the autumn of 1929 could have foreseen. But the country, the people, the stubborn, indestructible fabric of daily life that is woven from 10 million small and unremarkable acts of persistence. New rules were written. In the years that followed the crash, the men and women who governed the country sat down in their offices and their committee rooms and began, slowly, carefully, to redesign the architecture of the financial system. The Securities Act of 1933 required that companies tell the truth about the stocks they sold. A simple idea, almost embarrassingly simple, but one that had not existed before. The Securities Exchange Act of 1934 created the Securities and Exchange Commission, a body of regulators whose job it was to stand at the edge of the trading floor and watch, to look for the cracks, the imbalances, the places where the weight exceeded the strength of the structure, and to act before the floor gave way. These were quiet acts. They did not make for dramatic stories. They were the work of lawyers and legislators and civil servants, people who sat at desks and drafted clauses and debated the placement of commas, and who understood, in the sober light of what had happened, that the freedom to build must be balanced by the wisdom to build well. They were the people who added the margin, the white space, the room to breathe, the distance between the edge and the fall that had been missing before. And the morning came, as it always does, and the people rose, and they made their coffee, and they walked out into the light. And the light, though thinner than it had been in the summer of 1929, was still light. It still fell on the sidewalks and the storefronts and the faces of people walking to work. It still caught the windows of the tall buildings and turned them into mirrors, reflecting the sky back to itself. It still made shadows, And where there are shadows, there is something solid enough to cast them. Let us think one last time about Harold. Not the Harold of the barber shop. We have said goodbye to him, and he is doing well enough, in his way, with his scissors and his customers and his wife's pot roast. Let us think instead about all the Harolds, all the men and women who bought their 50 shares and opened their little notebooks and carried their quiet, glowing dreams into the future, only to find that the future was not quite what the chart on the wall had promised. They are still here, all of them. They did not vanish when the numbers changed. They did not cease to exist when the ticker tape stopped confirming their hopes. They went on. They swept their shops. They graded their papers. They carried their mail. They sat on their porches in the evening and watched the light change, and the light changed, and the seasons turned, and the years passed. And the dreams? The old dreams. The ones built from margin and ticker tape, and the golden optimism of a decade that believed in permanent plateaus. Those dreams were replaced, in time, by other dreams. Smaller ones, perhaps, more cautious, more aware of the wind, but dreams all the same. Because that is what human beings do. They dream, they build, they hope. And when the building falls, they sit for a while in the rubble, and then they stand up, and they brush themselves off, and they begin again. And the morning came, as it always does. The story is nearly over now. You can feel it, perhaps. The way you can feel the end of a piece of music before the last note sounds. The way you can feel the shoreline approaching before you see it. A change in the rhythm of the waves, a softening of the current, a gentleness in the motion of the water that says, we are almost there, almost home, almost at rest. And the morning came, as it always does, as it always does, as it always does. The light returns, the coffee is hot, the children need their shoes tied, the door needs to be opened. The day, this day, any day, every day, needs to be met and walked through and lived in. And finally, when the living is done, released gently into the evening, where it will join all the other days, all the other evenings, all the other quiet, ordinary, irreplaceable hours that make up the substance of a life. And the morning came, and you are here, and the night is soft, and sleep, patient, unhurried, gentle, is almost here. Chapter 14, The Quiet After the Story. And now the story is almost over. You can feel it the way you feel the end of a long walk. Not with your mind, but with your body. A softening in the legs, a loosening of the shoulders, a gentle downward pull that says, you have come far enough. You can stop now. The path has brought you where it was going to bring you, and the place where you stand is as good as any other place to rest. We have travelled a long way together, you and I. We have walked through the amber light of a summer morning in 1928, when the city was humming and the buildings were rising, and the shoeshine boy on Broad Street was counting his $47 in a coffee can beneath his bed. We have sat in the leather chairs of the customers' rooms, watching the ticker tape curl through our fingers, warm and thin and printed with the poetry of abbreviations, RCA, GM, USSTL, those small, precise syllables that carried for a while the weight of an entire nation's dreams. We have met Harold. We have stood in his barber shop and listened to the whisper of his broom on the tile floor and the slow turning of the ceiling fan and the music from the radio in the corner. We have watched him slip the notebook back into his apron pocket, and we have understood, without needing to be told, without needing to see the numbers, what it meant to him, and what it cost him, and why. Even after the numbers changed, he went on cutting hair and sweeping floors and walking up the narrow staircase to the kitchen that smelled of pot roast. Because that is what Harold does. And that is who Harold is. And the world, in the end, is held together not by markets, but by people like Harold. We have walked through the marble halls of Lower Manhattan, where the ceilings were high, and the voices were low, and the footsteps echoed on the polished floors. We have listened to the bankers speak their careful, measured words, and we have watched them gather at 23 Wall Street on a Thursday afternoon, arriving one by one with the unhurried dignity of men who knew that to appear frightened was to make things worse. We have stood on Broad Street with the crowd, looking up at the windows, waiting for news, and the windows told us nothing, and the news, when it came, was not what anyone had hoped for, and the crowd dispersed into the October evening, and the street lamps came on, and the city settled into the quiet that follows any great and exhausting event. We have read the letters that were never sent. We have floated on the river. We have watched the morning come, as it always does, and we have understood, slowly, gently, the way understanding arrives when you are not trying to force it, that this story, like all stories, is not about numbers or markets or the rise and fall of prices on a board. It is about people. It is about what they hoped for and what they feared. It is about the things they built, the towers of paper and confidence, the towers of marble and bronze, the small and sturdy towers of daily life that stand long after the others have fallen. It is about the morning that comes after even the longest night, and the coffee that is brewed, and the doors that are opened, and the children whose shoes need tying, and the ordinary, unremarkable, endlessly recurring miracle of going on. And now it is time to let the story go. Let it drift. Let it settle. Let it come to rest the way a leaf comes to rest on the surface of a still pond. Slowly, without sound, turning once, twice, and then lying flat, and then not moving at all, and then becoming, gradually, part of the stillness itself. The city is quiet now. The buildings stand in the dark, their windows dark, their lobbies empty, their marble floors reflecting nothing but the faintest glow of the street lamps outside. The ticker tape machines are still. The telephones are silent. The leather chairs in the customers' rooms are empty, and the blackboards have been wiped clean, and the chalk dust has settled on the ledges. And the numbers, all those numbers, the hundreds and the thousands and the millions, have been absorbed into the long, patient memory of the past, where they rest now, harmless and quiet, like old photographs in a drawer that no one opens anymore. The river flows on. It flows past the sleeping city, past the darkened piers, past the Statue of Liberty, with her torch held high against the stars. It flows without sound. It flows without effort. It carries the cold, clear water of the mountains through the deepest channel of the harbour and out, at last, into the open sea, where the current widens and slows and merges, finally, with the vast and borderless body of water that covers most of the world and has no name that anyone remembers and no end that anyone has ever found. And the night is here. The night is deep and soft and wide. It covers everything, the city and the countryside, the mountains and the prairies, the rivers and the roads, and the small dark houses where people sleep with their hands curled loosely on their pillows and their breathing slow and steady, and their dreams. Whatever dreams they have, whatever gentle, wordless stories their sleeping minds compose, drifting through the darkness like clouds across a sky that has no ceiling and no floor. You are one of them now. You are here, in the quiet, in the dark, in the soft, and weightless space between the last word of a story and the first breath of sleep. The story has carried you this far. It has carried you through the summer and the autumn, through the rise and the fall, through the marble halls and the barber shop and the letters and the river and the morning that always comes. And now the story is setting you down, gently, the way a wave sets a shell down on the sand, not dropping it, not throwing it, but placing it carefully in the exact spot where it belongs. And the market rose, and the market fell, and the people believed, and the people endured, and the morning came as it always does, and the river flows, and the night is quiet, and you are safe, and sleep is here. Good night.